Good evening, and welcome back to Bedtime Historian. Have you ever wondered how a single boy, born into a modest farmhouse on a quiet summer day in upstate New York, could one day control nearly every drop of oil that lit American homes and powered their machines? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're listening from somewhere special tonight, drop your city and local time in the comments below. I always enjoy seeing where the stories land. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. John Davison Rockefeller entered the world on the 8th of July, 1839, in a small clapboard house perched on a hillside in Richford, New York. The Finger Lakes region was still frontier country, then cleared patches of forest, muddy roads, log barns, and the smell of wood smoke drifting from every chimney. His father, William Avery Rockefeller, was known locally as Big Bill, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a quick smile and a talent for selling patent medicines, elixirs, and sharp deals. Bill moved frequently, chasing one scheme after another, often leaving the family behind for weeks or months. Neighbours called him a pitcher because he could talk anyone into anything, though many later said he rarely stayed long enough to deliver on his promises. John's mother, Eliza Davison Rockefeller, kept the household steady. She came from a strict Baptist family and brought that same discipline to her 6 children. Prayer and scripture filled the evenings. Waste of any kind was a sin. Eliza taught her children to read the Bible, to count every penny, and to trust in hard work rather than luck. When Bill was away, which was often, she managed the farm, the garden, and the children with calm efficiency. She wore plain dark dresses, kept her hair pulled back tightly, and spoke in a low, measured voice that carried authority without ever rising. The family moved several times during John's early years, first to Moravia, then to Owego, following Bill's shifting ventures. In those small towns, the boy saw the same rural pattern: men ploughing fields with oxen, women boiling laundry over open fires, children walking barefoot to one-room schoolhouses. Money was scarce. The Rockefeller table held cornmeal, mush, potatoes, salt pork, and whatever vegetables the garden produced. Clothes were patched and handed down. John wore homespun shirts and trousers that were let out at the seams as he grew. Shoes were a luxury saved for winter. By the time John was 10, the family settled briefly in Richford again, but Bill's reputation had begun to follow him. He sold miracle cures door to door, posed as a deaf and dumb herbalist to gain sympathy, and occasionally disappeared for long stretches. Some whispered he had another family elsewhere. John never spoke of these absences later, but the uncertainty left its mark. He learned early to rely on himself and his mother, rather than on a father who might not return. School was simple and short. John attended district schools where the teacher boarded with different families each week. He was a quiet, attentive pupil who finished his sums quickly and kept his slate clean. Arithmetic came easily. He liked the certainty of numbers. At home he raised turkeys, selling them at the local market for pocket money. He kept a small ledger in which he recorded every cent earned and spent. The habit of tracking money began there, in a child's careful handwriting. In 1853, when John was 14, the family made its most important move. Bill heard of better opportunities in Cleveland, Ohio, a growing lake port where canals met railroads, and new factories were rising along the Cuyahoga River. Eliza packed the household goods into wagons, and the family travelled west. The journey took days over rutted roads and muddy turnpikes. They crossed into Ohio in early spring, when the fields were still brown and the air carried the scent of thawing earth. Cleveland in the 1850s was a boom town of 30,000 people. Wooden sidewalks lined Euclid Avenue, horse-drawn omnibuses clattered past, and the smell of coal smoke hung over the waterfront. Immigrants from Ireland and Germany worked the docks and iron foundries. Lake freighters carried grain, lumber, and iron ore. The city felt alive with possibility, yet it remained rough mud in the streets after rain, pigs rooting in vacant lots, and the constant noise of hammers and saws. The Rockefellers rented a modest house on Erie Street. Bill opened a small store selling patent medicines and sundries, but his attention soon wandered to other ventures. Eliza continued to manage the home. John enrolled at Central High School, a 3-story brick building where he studied bookkeeping, penmanship, and commercial arithmetic. He walked to school each morning in neatly pressed clothes, carrying his books under his arm. Classmates remembered him as serious, polite, and unusually focused. He rarely joined games at recess, preferring to read or help the teacher with records. At 16, John left high school to take a 10-week commercial course at Folsom's Commercial College. There he learned double-entry bookkeeping, drafting business letters, and the basics of commercial law. He practiced penmanship until his script was precise and elegant. When he finished the course, he began looking for work, walking the streets with a letter of recommendation from his teacher. In September 1855, he found a position as assistant bookkeeper at Hewitt & Tuttle, commission merchants dealing in produce. He started at $3.50 a week. The office sat above a warehouse near the docks. Every morning John arrived early, swept the floor, opened the mail, and posted entries in the ledger. He wrote in black ink with a steel-nib pen, blotting each page carefully. He wore a plain dark suit, a white shirt, and a narrow tie. His hair was parted neatly. He spoke little, but his work was flawless. Those first paydays felt significant. He handed most of his wages to his mother, keeping only a small amount for personal expenses. He bought a cheap ledger of his own and recorded every transaction: car fare, a newspaper, a slice of bread. The habit of accounting for every cent never left him. Cleveland in those years was changing fast. The railroads linked the city to New York and Chicago. Telegraph lines carried news instantly. Gas lights replaced oil lamps on the main streets. Kerosene, distilled from Pennsylvania crude, began arriving by barrel. Most people still used candles or whale oil, but the new fuel burned brighter and cost less. Few yet understood how completely it would transform daily life. John noticed the barrels rolling off lake boats and the smell of oil that drifted from refineries along the river. He asked questions, listened to merchants talk about the new industry, and kept his thoughts to himself. At home he continued family prayers, attended Sunday services at the Erie Street Baptist Church, and taught a boys' Sunday school class. The church was plain wooden pews, a small organ, and a pulpit where the minister spoke of duty and stewardship. John listened carefully and took the lessons to heart. By age 18, he had saved enough to lend small sums to local businessmen at interest. He studied their character before agreeing to any loan. He never drank, never gambled, and avoided the saloons that lined Lower Euclid Avenue. His pleasures were simple: a walk along the lakefront, reading the newspaper, and quiet evenings at home with his mother and siblings. The country itself stood on the edge of war. In 1859, newspapers carried reports of John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry. Debates over slavery filled the churches and taverns. Cleveland's abolitionists met in halls downtown, while others argued for compromise. John read the accounts but kept his opinions private. His focus remained on work, savings, and the steady accumulation of responsibility. Those early years in Cleveland shaped him more than he could have known. The city taught him that opportunity came to those who prepared for it. His mother taught him that character mattered more than wealth. And his father's example, however flawed, showed him what happened when a man chased quick gains instead of building something lasting. Those early years in Cleveland shaped him more than he could have known. The city taught him that opportunity came to those who prepared for it. His mother taught him that character mattered more than wealth. And his father's example, however flawed, showed him what happened when a man chased quick gains instead of building something lasting. At Central High School, the routine began before dawn. John rose early, washed at the basin in the corner of the room, and dressed in the same plain dark suit he wore every day. The walk to school took him past rows of wooden houses and small shops just opening for the day. Inside the brick building on Euclid Avenue, the classrooms smelled of chalk and damp wool. He sat in the front row for mathematics lessons, working through problems in long columns that covered his slate completely. Teachers noted his neat handwriting and the way he double-checked every answer before raising his hand. On the debating team, he practiced speaking clearly about current issues, learning to organize thoughts without notes. Classmates came from merchant families, German households, and Irish neighborhoods. Conversations in the hallways mixed English with fragments of other languages. After classes, he returned home to help with the household work that kept the family running smoothly. He carried buckets of water from the public pump 2 blocks away, split kindling for the kitchen stove, and tended the small vegetable plot behind the house. His younger brothers and sisters followed him around the yard, learning the same tasks. Eliza supervised from the doorway, reminding everyone that nothing should be wasted. Scraps of cloth became patches for trousers. Leftover food went into soup for the next meal. John kept his own small account book updated each evening, noting every coin that changed hands. The habit grew stronger with practice, turning small savings into a growing pile hidden in a drawer. Cleveland itself was expanding in every direction during those years. Wooden sidewalks lined the main streets, but after rain the roads turned to deep mud that stuck to boots and wagon wheels. Horse-drawn omnibuses rattled along Euclid Avenue, carrying passengers from the lakefront to the growing residential districts. Down at the Cuyahoga River, the flats bustled with activity. Lake freighters unloaded lumber from Michigan, grain from Illinois, and iron ore from the Upper Lakes. German and Irish immigrants filled the docks and the new factory districts, speaking in accents that John heard on market days when he walked among the stalls. Vendors sold sausages wrapped in bread, potatoes boiled with cabbage, and fresh bread still warm from brick ovens. Clothing on the streets showed the mix of old country styles and practical American work clothes. Wool coats for winter, linen shirts in summer, sturdy boots for everyone who worked outdoors. Sunday mornings followed a fixed pattern. The family walked together to the Erie Street Baptist Church, where the plain wooden pews filled quickly. John sat listening to sermons on duty and self-reliance. He began teaching a class of younger boys in the Sunday school, explaining Bible stories in simple terms and collecting small donations for missions. The church community felt like an extension of home, with potluck suppers after services and quiet conversations about the news from Washington. Many members opposed slavery and followed the debates in Kansas with concern. John absorbed these discussions without speaking much himself, storing the information away like entries in his ledger. The financial panic that struck in 1857 tested every household in the city. Banks closed their doors, businesses laid off workers, and men stood in lines for city relief. The Rockefellers felt the pressure immediately. Bill's ventures slowed, and money for food grew tighter. Eliza stretched meals further, using more potatoes and less meat. John watched neighbors lose their stores and their homes. He saw families move away in the middle of the night to escape debts. The experience confirmed what his mother had always said. Security came from careful planning, not from hoping for better times. He continued his small loans to reliable people, always writing the terms clearly and collecting interest on time. Those transactions taught him to judge character as carefully as numbers. Evenings at home passed quietly. The family gathered around the table with a single lamp. Eliza read from the Bible while the children mended clothes or practiced penmanship. John sometimes walked to the lakefront alone, watching the lights of ships moving across the water. He thought about his future, setting quiet goals for himself. One was to earn enough to feel safe no matter what happened. Another was to live a long life, staying active and useful. He never spoke these thoughts aloud, but they guided his choices. He avoided the saloons near the river where young men spent wages on drink. He skipped the theatres and circuses that drew crowds on Saturday nights. Instead, he read the Cleveland newspapers cover to cover, tracking commodity prices and railroad news. By his late teens, the city had become familiar in every season. Spring brought mud that required extra care with boots. Summer filled the air with the scent of coal smoke and blooming lilacs along the avenues. Fall meant shorter days and the arrival of new shipments of grain before the lakes froze. Winter brought snow that muffled the sound of wagon wheels and turned the river into a grey ribbon of ice. Through all of it, John maintained the same steady pace. He rose at the same hour, completed his chores, attended school or work, and recorded every detail. His mother noticed the growing sense of responsibility in him and quietly approved. His siblings looked to him for guidance when their father was absent for long stretches. The immigrant neighbourhoods added colour to daily life without changing the family's routines. On market days, John passed stalls where German women sold sauerkraut and fresh sausages while Irish vendors offered potatoes and buttermilk. Children played stickball in vacant lots, their voices mixing accents. Churches of different denominations dotted the side streets, each with its own traditions of song and gathering. John respected these differences but stayed firmly within the Baptist circle that felt like home. The diversity around him showed how the city was pulling people from every direction, creating new opportunities for those who stayed organised and reliable. As the 1850s drew toward their close, the talk in churches and shops turned more often to national troubles. Newspapers carried stories of Southern secession threats and Northern determination to preserve the Union. Cleveland's factories began preparing for possible war orders. Merchants discussed the price of grain and hay that armies might need. John listened carefully during his walks and his Sunday school lessons, sensing that larger forces were gathering. He did not fear the future, but he understood that preparation would matter more than ever. His small savings account continued to grow, each entry written in the same precise hand. The years of youth in Ohio had given him a clear framework. School had sharpened his mind for figures and arguments. Household duties had taught him the value of consistent effort. The city's growth had shown him the scale of commerce possible when people worked together. The panic had reinforced the need for caution, and the church had anchored everything in a sense of moral order. None of these lessons came in dramatic moments. They arrived quietly through repetition and quiet observation, building inside him layer by layer. Family conversations around the table grew more serious as his older siblings began their own paths. His mother continued to manage the home with the same calm authority, stretching resources and reminding everyone of their duties. Bill appeared and disappeared on his own schedule, sometimes bringing small gifts and stories of distant places. John learned to navigate these shifts without complaint, focusing on what he could control. He helped his brothers with their schoolwork and encouraged his sisters in their sewing projects. The household remained a place of order even when the outside world felt uncertain. By the time he reached 18, the pattern of his days felt solid. He knew the streets of Cleveland as well as the lines in his account book. He understood the rhythms of the lake trade and the needs of local businesses. Most important, he had developed an inner discipline that required no external prompting. Rising early, working steadily, saving methodically, these actions had become as natural as breathing. The boy who had arrived from New York with patched clothes and careful habits had grown into a young man ready for larger responsibilities. Cleveland had given him the environment to test and strengthen those qualities every single day. Those early years in Cleveland had given him the environment to test and strengthen those qualities every single day. In September of 1855, just weeks after turning 16, John walked into the offices of Hewitt and Tuttle on the Cleveland waterfront and asked for work. The firm dealt in produce grain, hay, meats, and other goods shipped across the lakes. After a short conversation, Henry Tuttle hired him as an assistant bookkeeper at $3.50 per week. It was not a large sum, but to John it marked the true beginning of his working life. The office occupied the second floor of a brick building overlooking the Cuyahoga River. From the windows he could see the constant movement of wagons and lake boats. The air carried the mixed odours of grain dust, salted meat, and coal smoke from passing steamers. Every morning he arrived before the partners, unlocked the door, swept the wooden floors, and opened the windows to let in fresh air. Then he sat at his high desk with its slanted top, dipped his pen in black ink, and began posting the previous day's transactions into the main ledger. The work required absolute precision. He recorded every barrel of flour, every bushel of wheat, and every side of pork that came through the warehouse. Merchants arrived throughout the day with invoices, arguing over weights or prices. John checked each document twice before entering the figures. When shipments arrived late or short, he noted the discrepancies and prepared letters for the partners to send. His handwriting remained small, clear, and perfectly even. Errors were never allowed. If he spotted a mistake, he stayed late to correct it. His first weekly pay envelope felt surprisingly heavy in his pocket. He walked straight home and handed most of the money to his mother. With the small amount he kept, he bought a new ledger for his personal accounts and a better steel pen. That evening he carefully wrote the date and the amount earned, then subtracted what he had spent on paper and ink. The ritual became part of every Saturday night. He never spent on candy or toys like other boys his age. Instead, he saved for the future he was already imagining. The men at Hewitt and Tuttle soon noticed the new boy's reliability. Mr. Hewitt, the senior partner, began giving him additional responsibilities. John learned how to calculate interest on short-term loans the firm made to farmers. He tracked the fluctuating prices of oats and corn as news arrived by telegraph from Chicago and Buffalo. During busy seasons, he worked 10 or 11 hours a day without complaint. When the partners went out to lunch at nearby restaurants serving beef stew and fresh bread, he ate a simple sandwich at his desk to save the cost. Cleveland's commercial life flowed through the office doors every day. Farmers from the Western Reserve brought wagon loads of produce. Ship captains discussed lake conditions and delivery times. Traveling salesmen shared stories from Pittsburgh and Detroit. John listened quietly while he worked, absorbing information about credit terms, transportation costs, and the importance of reputation. He saw how one delayed shipment could damage a merchant's standing with customers. He watched men who borrowed too heavily lose everything when markets turned. These observations went into his mental ledger alongside the written numbers. The year 1856 brought national tension into the city. News of violence in Kansas reached Cleveland through newspapers and conversations on the docks. The presidential election that fall filled the streets with rallies and torchlight parades. John walked past crowds cheering for John C. Fremont or James Buchanan. He read the accounts carefully but kept his own views to himself. At the Baptist church, the minister preached on the moral questions of the day. John continued teaching his Sunday school class, using the hour to instill habits of honesty and hard work in the younger boys. As 1,857 arrived, the financial panic hit Cleveland hard. Banks suspended payments. Many produce merchants struggled to collect debts. Hewitt and Tuttle felt the pressure as orders slowed and customers asked for more time to pay. John worked even more carefully, tracking every outstanding account. He saw families he knew lose their businesses and move away. The experience strengthened his belief in keeping reserves and avoiding unnecessary risk. When the firm reduced his hours temporarily, he used the extra time to study commercial law books borrowed from the partners. By 1858, his salary had increased to $5 per week. The partners trusted him enough to leave him in charge of the office when they traveled to New York or Chicago on business. He handled incoming mail, met with suppliers, and prepared summary reports. In the evenings, he walked home along the gaslit streets, passing Irish labourers heading to their boarding houses and German families gathered on front steps. Vendors sold roasted chestnuts from carts near the square. He sometimes stopped for a cheap cup of coffee, but more often continued straight home to update his accounts and read the Bible with his family. The office taught him the human side of commerce. Some merchants arrived well-dressed and confident, others appeared worried and threadbare. John learned to judge character by how they honoured their promises. He developed the habit of writing brief notes about the men he dealt with, whether they were prompt, honest, or careless. These private observations later proved valuable. At church, he heard prayers for the nation as southern states grew more restless. The talk of possible war created uncertainty in the produce trade. Prices for hay and grain rose and fell with every rumour from Washington. John maintained the same quiet discipline outside the office. He continued attending prayer meetings on Wednesday evenings. He avoided the growing number of saloons along the riverfront where dock workers spent their wages. His clothes remained plain and well kept. He walked whenever possible instead of paying for omnibus fare. The small savings account he kept at a local bank grew steadily. Each new entry represented another step toward independence. By 1859, at age 20, he had become an essential part of Hewitt and Tuttle. The partners discussed promoting him to full bookkeeper. John listened to their plans, but already wondered whether working for others would ever satisfy him completely. He began calculating how much capital he would need to start a small business of his own. The idea remained private, shared with no one except his mother in quiet conversations. The waterfront world continued its daily rhythm. Ships arrived with Canadian wheat and departed with Ohio flour. Warehouses filled and emptied with the seasons. New telegraph poles stretched along the streets, bringing faster news from the east. John watched all of it from his tall desk, recording not just the numbers but learning the larger patterns of trade. He understood that success came to those who controlled costs and maintained trust. These lessons settled deep within him as the country moved closer to open conflict. The apprenticeship years gave him something school never could: direct contact with the real machinery of business. Every ledger entry, every merchant conversation, and every careful calculation added to his practical education. He developed confidence in his own judgment, while remaining outwardly modest and deferential. The office on the river became his university, teaching him skills and insights he would carry for the rest of his life. Produced partnership. The apprenticeship years gave him something school never could: direct contact with the real machinery of business. Every ledger entry, every merchant conversation, and every careful calculation added to his practical education. He developed confidence in his own judgment while remaining outwardly modest and deferential. The office on the river became his university, teaching him skills and insights he would carry for the rest of his life. In early 1859, John began looking beyond his position at Hewitt and Tuttle. He had saved nearly $1,000 from his wages and small loans he made on the side. At 20, he felt ready to risk a partnership rather than remain an employee. He approached Maurice B. Clark, a fellow bookkeeper he had known since their school days. Clark came from a similar background, careful, Baptist and ambitious. They agreed to form a commission merchant firm dealing in produce. John contributed his savings. Clark added his own capital and family connections in the trade. They rented a small office and warehouse space near the docks in March 1859. The sign read, "Clark and Rockefeller, Commission Merchants." The business bought grain, hay, meats, and other farm products from local growers, then sold them to wholesalers in New York, Buffalo, and Chicago. John handled the books while Clark managed most of the buying and selling on the floor. Their division of labour suited their temperaments. John preferred the quiet certainty of figures. Clark enjoyed the negotiations and handshakes. The first months tested their arrangement. Shipments arrived irregularly, prices swung with weather reports, and customers sometimes delayed payment. John kept meticulous records of every transaction, tracking costs down to the penny for storage, drayage, and commissions. When a load of hay spoiled due to rain, he noted the loss immediately and adjusted future contracts to include better insurance terms. Clark admired the precision and began relying on John's calculations for pricing decisions. The outbreak of the Civil War in April 1861 changed everything almost overnight. Union armies needed vast supplies of food. Demand for grain, flour, pork, and beef surged. Prices rose steadily as government agents bought for the troops. Clark and Rockefeller positioned themselves well. They secured contracts to supply hay for cavalry horses and salted meats for soldiers' rations. Profits grew quickly. The partners reinvested earnings into larger purchases, expanding their warehouse space along the river. Cleveland's streets reflected the wartime shift. Uniformed recruits drilled in public squares. Women sewed flags and bandages for aid societies. The lake trade boomed with shipments heading east to supply the Army of the Potomac. John walked past recruiting offices every morning, hearing drums and bugles. Newspapers carried casualty lists and battle reports. At church, the congregation prayed for the Union cause, and collections supported sanitary commissions. John continued his Sunday school teaching, now including lessons on patriotism and duty alongside scripture. The partnership thrived amid the chaos. By 1862, their annual profits reached several $1,000s. John still lived frugally, walking to work and eating plain meals at home. He wore the same dark suit year after year, patching it when necessary. His personal ledger showed steady growth in savings. He loaned small amounts to reliable men at modest interest, always with written agreements. Clark spent more freely, enjoying better clothes and occasional dinners out, but John never criticised the difference. Their complementary styles kept the business running smoothly. Daily life in wartime Cleveland mixed routine with urgency. Rationing affected some goods, though food remained plentiful due to the Midwest's farms. Coal prices rose, making winters feel longer. Gaslights flickered along the avenues at night. John noticed soldiers on leave crowding the train stations, families saying hurried goodbyes. The air carried the constant scent of wood smoke from cook stoves, and the sharper smell of gunpowder from nearby arsenals producing cartridges. In the office the pace quickened. Telegraph messages arrived with army requisitions. John worked late into the evenings, updating ledgers by lamplight. He developed systems to track inventory more efficiently, using separate columns for government contracts versus private sales. When suppliers tried to inflate prices, he compared market quotations from Chicago and refused unfair deals. Clark handled the personal relationships with buyers, often travelling to secure larger orders. Their combined efforts turned modest beginnings into a profitable enterprise. By mid-1862, the partners had accumulated enough capital to consider new opportunities. John read reports about oil discoveries in Pennsylvania. Kerosene lamps were replacing candles in homes across the north. Refineries sprang up along the Allegheny River, shipping barrels to Cleveland by rail and lake. The commodity intrigued him: high demand, growing supply, and potential for steady profits. He discussed the idea with Clark, who expressed cautious interest. They began watching oil prices in the newspapers and talking to merchants who dealt in the new product. The war continued to shape their world. In 1863, news of Gettysburg reached Cleveland by special editions. Church bells rang in celebration when victories came, tolled solemnly after defeats. John followed the campaigns through daily papers, noting how supply lines affected commodity prices. The business benefited from army needs, but also felt the strain when transportation routes were disrupted. He maintained strict accounting to weather any sudden changes. Family life remained anchored in the same patterns. Eliza managed the household with quiet efficiency. John's siblings grew older. Some began their own small jobs. Bill appeared sporadically, bringing tales of distant ventures. John provided for the family when needed, ensuring bills were paid on time. Evenings often ended with Bible reading and prayer. He avoided the wartime distractions, speculation in greenbacks, gambling on war news that tempted many young men. The partnership reached its peak in 1863. Profits from wartime demand allowed them to clear debts and build reserves. John calculated that they could safely branch into another line without overextending. The oil trade offered exactly that, a product with rising consumption and fewer seasonal fluctuations than farm goods. He proposed investing in a refinery. Clark agreed after reviewing the numbers John prepared. Their produce business had proven the value of careful management in uncertain times. John learned to read market signals, negotiate quietly, and protect capital above all else. The war years accelerated his education in scale and risk. What began as a small commission firm had grown into a solid foundation for larger ventures. The lessons of thrift, precision, and timing would prove essential in the years ahead. First, oil refinery. The lessons of thrift, precision, and timing would prove essential in the years ahead. By the summer of 1863, John had watched the oil trade long enough to see its potential clearly. Barrels of crude arrived daily on lake boats from Pennsylvania, carried south from the new fields around Titusville. Refineries along the Cuyahoga River turned the thick black liquid into kerosene for lamps. The product burned brighter than whale oil, cost less, and smelled cleaner. Demand grew steadily in homes and factories across the north as the war continued. John calculated the margins. Crude cost little to buy, refining required simple equipment, and the finished products sold at steady prices. He saw opportunity in the gaps, poor quality control at many small plants, inconsistent shipping, and waste in the process. He discussed the idea with Maurice Clark. Clark had grown comfortable with the produce trade's wartime profits and hesitated at first. Oil seemed riskier, more volatile than grain or pork. John prepared detailed figures showing transportation costs, refinery expenses, and projected returns based on current market quotations. The numbers convinced Clark to join. They agreed to invest $4,000 each, most of their accumulated capital from the commission business. In late 1863, they formed a new partnership with a young chemist named Samuel Andrews, who had experience in refining techniques. Andrews brought technical knowledge. The others supplied the money and business sense. Their first refinery rose on the south bank of the Cuyahoga, a wooden structure with stills, storage tanks, and a small office. Construction finished quickly. By early 1864, the plant began operations. John oversaw the bookkeeping and cost controls from the start. He insisted on buying the best barrels for shipping to reduce leakage. He tracked every gallon of crude purchased, every drop of kerosene produced, and every barrel of byproducts like naphtha and lubricants. Waste offended him. He worked to capture and sell what others discarded. The refinery ran day and night in shifts, with workers tending fires under the stills and drawing off the distilled fractions at precise temperatures. Cleveland's oil district grew rapidly around them. Smoke rose from dozens of small plants along the river. Teams of horses pulled wagons loaded with barrels through muddy streets. The air carried the sharp, acrid smell of refining mixed with coal smoke from the city. Workers, many recent immigrants, lived in boarding houses nearby, eating quick meals of bread and sausage before long shifts. John arrived early each morning, walking from home along streets still quiet except for the rumble of carts. He wore the same plain suit, now slightly worn at the cuffs from constant use. The war influenced the new venture directly. Army contracts needed kerosene for camp lanterns and hospital lighting. Prices held firm even as crude supply fluctuated with drilling news from Pennsylvania. Railroads carried more barrels east to supply the Union armies. John studied freight rates and negotiated with agents for better terms when possible. He avoided speculation on crude prices, preferring steady refining margins over gambling on market swings. The approach paid off. By the end of 1864, the refinery turned consistent profits, while many competitors struggled with quality issues or fires. Daily life during those years balanced the demands of two businesses. John split his time between the produce office and the refinery. Mornings often meant checking ledgers at the commission firm. Afternoons involved inspecting stills and talking with Andrews about improvements. Evenings brought him home to Eliza's table, simple suppers of boiled meat, potatoes, and bread. The family prayed together, read scripture, and discussed the day's events quietly. John's siblings noticed his longer hours but respected his focus. Bill appeared less frequently, pursuing his own ventures elsewhere. In September 1864, John married Laura Celestia Spellman. They had known each other since childhood through church and school circles. Laura came from a family that valued education and Baptist principles. She taught school briefly before the wedding. The ceremony took place at the Spellman home, small and plain, with only close family present. Laura wore a modest dress, John a dark suit. They moved into a rented house near the city centre. Laura managed the home with the same careful efficiency John applied to business. She kept accounts of household expenses, avoided waste, and maintained a quiet routine of reading, sewing, and church activities. The marriage brought stability amid growing responsibilities. Laura understood John's long hours and never complained. She attended services at the Erie Street Baptist Church with him, where he continued Sunday school teaching when time allowed. Their first child, Elizabeth, arrived in 1866, followed by others in the years ahead. The household remained frugal, plain furniture, simple meals, no luxuries. John walked to work rather than taking carriages, even as profits increased. He continued recording every personal expenditure in his ledger. The refinery partnership expanded quickly. By 1865, they built a second plant to increase capacity. John pushed for vertical control, buying cooperage to make their own barrels, securing steady crude supplies through contracts. He studied the transportation side, lake boats, rail lines and pipelines just beginning to appear in Pennsylvania. When competitors wasted byproducts, he found markets for naphtha as a solvent and lubricants for machinery. Quality became a priority. Their kerosene burned with less smoke and odour, earning repeat customers. Cleveland itself reflected the oil boom. New streets filled with warehouses and supply stores. Immigrants arrived in larger numbers to work the plants. The riverfront grew crowded with tank cars and barrel stacks. Fires occurred frequently, sparks from stills igniting wooden buildings. John installed better safety measures after one nearby blaze. He also watched the growing number of refiners, noting how many failed through poor management or overexpansion. By 1866, the Civil War had ended. Soldiers returned to civilian life. The economy adjusted to peacetime, with some price drops but steady demand for kerosene as homes across the country adopted lamps. John's produce business continued profitably, though the refinery began to draw more of his attention. Clark preferred the older trade. Tensions arose over how much capital to shift. John remained calm, focusing on facts and figures rather than arguments. The first refinery years solidified his approach. He learned the technical side from Andrew's fractional distillation, acid treatment for purification. He mastered cost accounting in a new industry tracking labour, fuel and raw material expenses per gallon produced. He saw the advantage of scale. Larger plants lowered unit costs. He began thinking about consolidation, though the idea stayed private for now. Family life provided quiet balance. Laura gave birth to John Jr. in 1874, though earlier children came first. The home filled with children's voices, yet routine stayed orderly. John read to his family in the evenings when possible, choosing practical books on history or science. Church remained central prayer meetings, collections for missions, and community support for those in need. The transition from produce to oil happened gradually but decisively. Profits from the refinery outpaced the commission business. John reinvested carefully, avoiding debt. He maintained personal frugality even as wealth accumulated. The lessons of the war years, steady supply contracts, cost control, quality focus carried directly into the new field. By the late 1860s, he stood on the threshold of something much larger, though few around him yet realized how far the path would lead. Marriage to Laura. The lessons of the war years, steady supply contracts, cost control, quality focus carried directly into the new field. By the late 1860s, he stood on the threshold of something much larger, though few around him yet realized how far the path would lead. John and Laura had known each other for years before their marriage. They first met as children through the Baptist church community in Cleveland. Laura Celestia Spellman, called Chetty by family and friends, came from a household that prized education and quiet discipline. Her father had once been a successful merchant, but lost much in the 1857 panic. The Spellmans lived modestly after that, relying on careful management and mutual support. Laura attended Central High School like John, though a few years behind him. She excelled in her studies and later taught school for a short time, bringing the same attention to detail to her classroom that John applied to his ledgers. Their courtship unfolded slowly and without fanfare. They saw each other at church services, prayer meetings, and occasional social gatherings hosted by mutual friends. Conversations remained proper and reserved discussions of scripture, current events, or family matters. John appreciated Laura's steady temperament and her shared values. No drinking, no extravagance, a deep sense of duty. Laura respected John's seriousness and his growing success in business. By 1862, they understood each other well enough to speak of a future together. The engagement came quietly in 1863, announced only to close family. The wedding took place on the 8th of September 1864, at the Spellman family home on Cedar Avenue. The ceremony was small. A Baptist minister officiated. Guests included immediate family and a few church friends. Laura wore a simple white dress made by her mother, with no elaborate train or veil. John stood in his usual dark suit, his hair neatly combed. Vows were exchanged in the front parlour, followed by a modest reception of cake, tea and light sandwiches. No dancing or alcohol appeared. The event reflected the values both families held: restraint, faith and practicality. The couple moved into a rented house on Cheshire Street, a modest 2-story frame building with a small yard. Laura set up the home efficiently. Furniture came second-hand or plain new pieces: wooden chairs, a sturdy table, a cast-iron stove. Curtains were simple cotton. The kitchen held basic utensils and a pantry stocked with staples: flour, potatoes, dried beans, salt pork. Laura kept household accounts in a notebook, much like John's business ledgers. Every purchase was recorded, every leftover used in the next meal. Waste remained unthinkable. John continued his long days at the refinery and produce office. He left before dawn, returned after dark. Laura managed the house alone during those hours, preparing meals, washing clothes in a tub by hand, and keeping the rooms clean and orderly. When John came home, they ate supper together, often boiled beef with vegetables from the market, bread baked that morning, and milk or water to drink. Conversations centred on the day's events, church news, or plans for the future. They read the Bible together most evenings, discussing passages quietly before retiring. Their first child, Lucy, arrived in 1865. The birth took place at home, with a midwife in attendance. Laura recovered steadily, continuing her household duties as soon as strength returned. John helped when he could, though business demands kept him away much of the day. A second daughter, Bessie, followed in 1867. The household grew busier but remained calm. Laura taught the girls early lessons in reading and scripture. She dressed them in plain cotton frocks, mended by hand. Toys were few wooden blocks, simple dolls made from scraps. The children learned to share and to help with small chores as soon as they could walk. The Rockefeller home followed strict routines. Mornings began with family prayer. Breakfast included oatmeal or eggs from the market, always eaten at the same time. John left for work on foot, carrying his lunch in a tin pail: bread, cheese, an apple. Laura spent the day caring for the children, sewing, and preparing dinner. Evenings brought the family together again. John sometimes read aloud from history books or the newspaper. Bedtime came early. The house stayed quiet after dark, lit by kerosene lamps that John himself helped perfect through his refining work. Cleveland in the late 1860s showed the marks of post-war growth. The population swelled past 100,000. New brick buildings replaced wooden ones downtown. Streetcars replaced some omnibuses, running on iron rails. The oil industry dominated the flats, with refineries stretching along both banks of the river. Smoke hung low on still days. Workers walked home covered in soot, their clothes smelling of petroleum. Immigrants from Poland and Bohemia joined the earlier German and Irish arrivals, filling neighbourhoods with new languages and customs. Markets offered a wider variety of goods. Fresh fruit from the south, canned vegetables, factory-made clothing. John and Laura shopped carefully. They bought meat from trusted butchers, vegetables in season, and dry goods in bulk to save money. Clothing came from local tailors or ready-made stores, always durable and plain. Laura made many of the children's garments herself, using patterns cut from newspaper. The family attended church every Sunday, walking the few blocks to the Erie Street Baptist Mission, where John still taught Sunday school when his schedule allowed. Collections supported home missions and foreign work. The couple gave generously but discreetly, never seeking recognition. Business pressures increased during these years. The refinery partnership with Clark and Andrews produced steady profits, but disagreements surfaced. Clark favoured caution and diversification. John pushed for expansion and greater control over every stage of production. Tensions simmered without open conflict. John spent more time studying transportation rail rates, pipeline experiments in Pennsylvania, barrel manufacturing costs. He began buying small competing refineries when owners struggled. Each acquisition added capacity and reduced competition in Cleveland. The home provided a counterbalance. Laura created an atmosphere of order and warmth without display. Meals stayed simple but nourishing. The children received consistent attention and moral instruction. John found relief in the quiet evenings reading with Laura, watching the girls play on the rug, discussing plans for the family's future. He never brought business worries home in detail. Laura asked few questions about finances, trusting his judgment completely. Their partnership in marriage mirrored the one in business. Mutual respect, shared values, division of responsibilities. By 1870, the family had moved to a slightly larger house on Euclid Avenue, still modest by Cleveland standards. The new home had more rooms for the growing children, and a small garden where Laura planted vegetables and flowers. John installed better lighting with his own kerosene. The street outside saw increasing carriage traffic as the city's wealthy built larger homes farther east. The Rockefellers remained apart from that world, no lavish parties, no imported furnishings. Their social circle stayed within the church community, ministers, teachers, small businessmen who shared their outlook. The marriage years brought John a personal stability that supported his growing ambitions. Laura's calm presence anchored the household. She handled illness, childhood accidents, and daily demands without complaint. John provided the financial foundation, always increasing. Together they raised children who learned early the same lessons of thrift, duty, and faith that had shaped both parents. The home on Euclid Avenue became a place of quiet strength amid the expanding industrial city around it. Standard Oil founding. The home on Euclid Avenue became a place of quiet strength amid the expanding industrial city around it. By 1870, the refining business in Cleveland had reached a point of intense competition. More than 30 plants operated along the Cuyahoga, each struggling to secure crude supplies, control costs, and find reliable markets. Many refiners bought oil on speculation, borrowed heavily, and burned low-quality kerosene that damaged lamps and reputations. John saw the inefficiency everywhere duplicated efforts, price wars that destroyed profits, and waste at every stage. He concluded that smaller operators could not survive long without coordination. The solution lay in combining resources under one management. In January 1870, he reorganized the partnership. He dissolved the existing Clark Andrews Rockefeller arrangement and formed the Standard Oil Company of Ohio. Capital stood at $1 million, divided into shares. John held the largest portion. Henry Flagler, a Cleveland attorney and salt merchant who had become a close advisor, joined as a key partner. Samuel Andrews stayed on for technical oversight. Morris Clark received a buyout after some negotiation. He preferred independence over further expansion. The new company consolidated several existing refineries under a single name. The word Standard reflected the goal, uniform quality that customers could trust. The offices moved to a larger building downtown. John kept his desk near the accounting department where he could review daily reports. Ledgers now tracked production across multiple plants, barrels refined, gallons shipped, costs per unit. He introduced strict standards for every process. Crude arrived by rail from Pennsylvania. Inspectors checked quality before acceptance. Stills operated at precise temperatures to maximize kerosene yield. Barrels bore the Standard brand, stenciled clearly. Rejected batches went back or were reworked. This consistency built buyer loyalty in New York, Boston, and Europe. Daily operations reflected the new structure. Foremen received written instructions on output targets and safety rules. Workers now numbering in the hundreds followed set shifts. Pay came regularly, but John expected steady performance. He visited plants often, walking the floors in his plain suit, observing stills and storage tanks. He spoke little to employees but listened carefully to their suggestions on small improvements. Waste remained his chief concern. He ordered pipes installed to capture escaping gases and sell them as fuel. Cleveland in 1870 showed the full effects of industrial growth. Euclid Avenue had become a fashionable residential street, with larger homes set back from the road. Streetcars clanged along tracks carrying clerks and factory hands. The population approached 150,000. New factories produced everything from iron forgings to clothing. The oil district along the river stayed noisy and smoky, with whistles signalling shift changes. Markets sold imported foods alongside local produce, bananas from the south, coffee from Brazil. Clothing styles shifted slightly. Men wore narrower trousers, women longer skirts with modest bustles. At home, Laura managed the expanding family. 3 daughters, Lucy, Bessie, and Alta, filled the house with activity. John Jr. arrived in 1874. Laura oversaw lessons, meals, and bedtime routines. The children wore simple clothes and learned household tasks early. John joined family prayers when he returned from work. He read to the children from the Bible or practical books on geography and natural history. Laura kept the household budget tight, recording expenses in her own ledger. No display entered their lives, no fancy china, no imported furniture. Guests came rarely, and only from church circles. John's days followed a predictable rhythm. He rose at 6, ate breakfast with the family oatmeal, eggs, coffee, then walked to the office. Mornings meant reviewing production figures and freight bills. Afternoons involved meetings with Flagler on railroad negotiations or new acquisitions. He approved every major expenditure personally. Evenings brought him home for supper roast chicken or beef stew, vegetables, bread, and family time. He avoided social clubs and dinners with other businessmen. His network remained small: church members, a few trusted partners, and family. The company grew methodically. By 1872, Standard Oil controlled about 10% of Cleveland refining capacity. John targeted weaker competitors for purchase. He offered fair prices based on asset value, not inflated wartime figures. Many owners accepted cash or stock rather than face continued losses. When some resisted, he lowered prices temporarily in their markets until they reconsidered. The tactic worked without open hostility. By the mid-1870s, the company had absorbed most Cleveland refineries. Plants closed or converted to standard operations. Workers transferred to the larger organization, often at similar wages but with steadier employment. Transportation became a key focus. Railroads charged high rates for oil shipments. John and Flagler negotiated rebates, lower per-barrel fees in exchange for guaranteed volume. The arrangements stayed secret at first, known only to top management. These deals reduced shipping costs significantly compared to smaller refiners. John viewed the rebates as a legitimate volume discount, not favoritism. The savings went into lower kerosene prices, which expanded the market further. The national context shaped these moves. The post-war years brought rapid railroad expansion. Lines connected the Midwest to eastern ports. Telegraph wires carried instant price information. Immigration continued, swelling the labor force. Cleveland's economy shifted from lake trade to heavy manufacturing. Banks grew larger, offering credit to expanding firms. John borrowed modestly when needed, always with collateral and clear repayment terms. He maintained large cash reserves to weather downturns. Church life remained central. John increased contributions to Baptist missions and local charities. He served on church committees, reviewing budgets and building plans. Laura taught Sunday school classes for girls. The family attended services faithfully, walking the short distance in all weather. Sermons often addressed stewardship and honest dealing themes John applied directly to business. He saw no conflict between profit and principle when conducted fairly. By 1875, Standard Oil refined nearly all the oil processed in Cleveland. The company built storage tanks, purchased pipelines in Pennsylvania, and entered barrel manufacturing. John centralized purchasing to secure better crude prices. He hired chemists to improve refining techniques, reducing waste further. Kerosene prices fell steadily, making lamps affordable for more households. Sales reached Europe and Asia through export agents. The brand gained recognition for reliability. Family routines adapted to John's growing responsibilities. Laura handled more of the children's education at home when tutors proved expensive. She organised small gatherings for church friends, simple teas with homemade cakes. John occasionally brought partners home for quiet discussions, but business talk stayed limited. The children learned early to respect their father's work hours and privacy. The founding of Standard Oil marked a turning point. What began as a single refinery had become an integrated enterprise controlling production from crude purchase to final sale. John's methods, precision, consolidation, cost reduction, proved effective on a larger scale. The company stood poised for national dominance, though public attention remained limited. In Cleveland, the name Rockefeller now meant oil, but the man himself stayed the same, quiet, methodical, and focused on the next logical step: railroad rebates expansion. In Cleveland, the name Rockefeller now meant oil, but the man himself stayed the same, quiet, methodical, and focused on the next logical step. The next logical step lay in transportation. Railroads carried nearly all the crude from Pennsylvania fields to Cleveland refineries, and then the finished kerosene east to markets. Rates fluctuated wildly, and smaller operators paid full published prices while larger shippers sometimes received discounts. John studied the schedules and costs for months. In 1871, he and Henry Flagler began direct talks with the major lines, the Lake Shore, the Erie, and the Pennsylvania Railroad. They offered guaranteed daily volumes in exchange for lower per-barrel rates. The railroads agreed. The deals remained private, recorded only in company ledgers as standard volume adjustments. Savings reached 30 to 50% on some routes. John viewed the arrangement as sound business practice. Steady shipments benefited both sides, and the lower costs allowed Standard Oil to reduce kerosene prices for customers. The rebates accelerated growth. Standard Oil now controlled most Cleveland refining capacity. John turned attention to the remaining independent plants. He approached owners one by one with offers based on current asset values, tanks, stills, land, and inventory. Many accepted cash or stock in the company. Those who hesitated faced sharper competition. Standard could sell kerosene cheaper because of its transportation advantages. By early 1872, 22 of the 26 independent refineries in the city had joined Standard or closed. The acquisitions happened quietly, through lawyers and accountants. No public auctions or dramatic takeovers occurred. Workers from the absorbed plants simply received new pay envelopes from the larger firm. John ensured continuity where possible, though he streamlined operations to eliminate duplication. The South Improvement Company episode tested the limits of these strategies. In late 1871, a group of railroads and refiners formed a loose alliance to stabilize rates and allocate markets. Standard Oil participated along with a few others. The plan called for higher published freight rates for everyone, with secret rebates returned only to participants. News leaked in February 1872. Newspapers in Pennsylvania and New York denounced the scheme as a conspiracy against small producers. Crowds burned effigies in oil towns. The Pennsylvania legislature revoked the company's charter within weeks. John withdrew Standard Oil from the arrangement immediately. He had gained useful information about railroad thinking and competitor weaknesses, but the public backlash taught him caution. From then on, he avoided visible alliances and focused on internal efficiency. Cleveland adjusted to the new scale of oil operations. The river district expanded with additional tank farms and barrel works. Trains arrived hourly with crude, their whistles cutting through the daytime noise. Workers in heavy boots and oil-stained overalls walked the same streets John had known since boyhood. Markets still offered the same staples: potatoes, cabbage, salt pork, but now included more canned goods and factory bread for busy households. Clothing remained practical. Dark wool suits for office men, sturdy denim for labourers. Gas lamps burned longer into the evenings as the city grew past 200,000 people. Streetcars ran on tighter schedules, carrying clerks home from downtown offices. At home, the family routine held steady. Laura managed 4 children now, with another on the way. Meals stayed simple: stews, fresh bread, vegetables from the garden plot. John walked the short distance to work each morning, carrying his lunch in the same tin pail. Evenings brought Bible readings and quiet talks about church matters. He increased his giving to the Erie Street Baptist Mission, supporting new building funds and foreign missionaries. Laura taught the older girls sewing and basic accounting so they could help with household records. The children played in the yard with simple toys, hoops, balls made from yarn scraps. No servants lived in. Laura handled most chores herself with occasional day help for laundry. John's inner calculations never stopped. He reviewed weekly production reports at his desk, noting every variation in cost per gallon. Waste still troubled him most. He ordered new acid recovery systems to reuse chemicals in the refining process. Byproducts once dumped into the river now became paraffin wax or lubricating oils sold separately. He travelled occasionally to New York to meet export agents, always by train and always in the same plain clothes. Flagler handled much of the legal side, drafting contracts and reviewing railroad agreements. The partnership worked smoothly because each man respected the other's strengths, John on costs and operations, Flagler on deals and expansion. Public sentiment shifted during these years. Newspapers began labelling large combinations as trusts, though the word carried no legal meaning yet. Farmers in the Midwest complained about railroad rates for grain, drawing parallels to oil shipping. John read the articles carefully but saw no reason to change course. His rebates came from volume, not favoritism, and the resulting lower prices helped ordinary households afford brighter lighting. At church, the minister spoke of stewardship and the moral use of wealth. John took those lessons literally, viewing efficient business as a form of service. By the end of 1872, Standard Oil refined more than a quarter of all American oil. Market share in the domestic kerosene trade climbed steadily. Exports to Europe increased through New York Harbor. John began purchasing crude directly from producers in Pennsylvania rather than relying on middlemen. Pipeline experiments in the oil regions interested him. He invested modestly in early lines to secure supply. Cleveland itself benefited from the payrolls. New houses appeared on side streets, schools expanded, and the lake trade continued alongside the oil boom. Family life absorbed the changes without disruption. Laura gave birth to Edith in 1872. The household adjusted by adding another small bed and shifting rooms. John remained present for evening prayers when possible. He taught the children the habit of recording small expenditures, just as his mother had taught him. Sundays meant church attendance, a walk along Euclid Avenue, and simple suppers. The family avoided the growing number of public entertainments, circuses, theatres, horse races that drew crowds downtown. Their circle stayed small and church-centred. The railroad deals and acquisitions consolidated power without fanfare. John kept daily routines unchanged: early rising, precise record-keeping, frugal personal habits. He maintained the same modest house, the same walking pace to the office, the same careful diet. Internally, he planned the next phase, centralized management across regions. Externally, he appeared unchanged, a quiet family man who happened to run the largest refining operation in the country. The controversy over the South Improvement Company had passed, leaving Standard Oil stronger and more disciplined. Market share continued to climb as efficiency replaced competition in the oil fields and on the rails. The early 1870s had shown that scale brought advantages in every direction. Lower unit costs, reliable supply, consistent quality, these became standard operating practice. John stored the lessons of public criticism for future reference, but refused to slow the methodical expansion. The company now reached beyond Cleveland, with offices in New York and Philadelphia. Rail rebates extended to those routes. Competitors in other cities watched nervously. John, however, focused on the figures in his ledgers and the next logical improvement: trust formation. The company now reached beyond Cleveland, with offices in New York and Philadelphia. Rail rebates extended to those routes. Competitors in other cities watched nervously. John, however, focused on the figures in his ledgers and the next logical improvement: As the 1870s drew to a close, Standard Oil had spread well beyond Cleveland. Refineries in Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and New York now operated under the same management. Pipelines carried crude directly from Pennsylvania wells to tank farms. Marketing agents sold kerosene in every major city and many smaller towns. The company employed thousands of men across several states. Coordination between distant plants grew difficult under existing partnership agreements. Different state laws restricted how much one company could own in another. John and Flagler recognized the need for a new structure that could hold all these pieces together legally and efficiently. In 1882, they created the Standard Oil Trust. 9 trustees received control of all the stock in the various companies. Shareholders exchanged their certificates for trust certificates that represented their share of the entire enterprise. John became the largest holder and de facto head. The trustees met regularly in New York, where the main offices had moved. Decisions on pricing, crude purchases, and new construction came from this central group. The arrangement allowed the company to function as one organization while respecting state corporation limits at the time. The trust brought immediate order. Reports flowed to New York from every refinery and sales district. John reviewed summaries that showed national production, export volumes, and cost comparisons. He continued his old habit of examining every major expense. Pipelines expanded rapidly because the trust could fund large projects. Marketing departments standardized the blue barrels and the quality of kerosene. Overseas sales increased through agents in London and Shanghai. American homes and factories relied more heavily on the product as electricity remained expensive and limited. Cleveland operations continued as the heart of the system. The original refineries along the Cuyahoga ran at high capacity. New tank cars rolled out of the company shops. Workers lived in the same neighborhoods, now with slightly better wages and more regular hours. The river district smelled of oil and coal, with whistles marking shift changes throughout the day. John still visited the Cleveland plant several times each year, walking the grounds and speaking with foremen about small improvements. He wore the same dark suits, now made of better cloth but cut in the same plain style. At home the family had grown. John Jr. was 8 years old in 1882. The girls, Lucy, Bessie, Alta, and Edith, ranged from teenagers to young children. Laura directed the household with steady authority. Meals remained simple: roast beef on Sundays, vegetable soups during the week, fresh bread baked daily. The children learned arithmetic at the kitchen table using the same methods John had practiced as a boy. Laura taught the girls sewing and household management. John spent time with them on Sunday afternoons when possible, taking walks or reading from history books. He gave each child a small allowance and required them to keep accounts, just as he had done. The Euclid Avenue house had become more comfortable without becoming luxurious. A larger garden supplied vegetables. Laura added a few pieces of solid oak furniture. Curtains stayed plain. The family kept one carriage for church and occasional visits, but John still walked to nearby appointments. Servants now helped with heavier cleaning and cooking as the children grew. Laura supervised them closely, insisting on the same standards of thrift and honesty. Church remained the center of their social life. The family attended the Euclid Avenue Baptist Church, which had replaced the smaller mission. John served on the finance committee, reviewing budgets and missionary contributions. He increased his personal giving each year, supporting new colleges and hospitals through the Baptist network. Laura taught women's Bible classes. The children participated in Sunday school programs. Sermons often touched on the responsibilities of wealth and the importance of using money for good. John listened attentively and applied the principles in his decisions. The broader country experienced rapid change during these years. Railroads spanned the continent. Telegraph lines carried news instantly. Factories in the East produced goods on a scale never seen before. Cities like Chicago and New York swelled with immigrants. Labor unions formed in some industries, demanding shorter hours and higher pay. Farmers in the West complained about railroad rates and falling crop prices. John read the newspapers each morning, noting how these developments affected oil demand and transportation costs. He avoided public comment on political questions, keeping his focus on business operations. The trust structure proved highly effective. By the mid-1880s, Standard Oil controlled approximately 90% of American refining capacity. Kerosene prices continued to fall, making lighting affordable for working families. Lubricating oils supported the growing machine age. The company built storage facilities in major ports and developed its own fleet of tank cars. John pushed for research into new uses for petroleum byproducts. Paraffin wax went into candles. Asphalt appeared on city streets. These secondary products added steady income. Daily life in the Rockefeller household followed its established pattern. John rose early, reviewed reports at his desk before breakfast, then walked or rode to the local office. Laura planned the day's meals and lessons. The older girls helped with younger siblings. Evenings brought family gatherings around the table. John asked the children about their studies and encouraged careful spending. He never discussed company matters in detail at home, but the children understood their father worked in oil. They saw the blue barrels on wagons passing through the city. By 1885, the family began spending more time in New York. The trust headquarters demanded John's presence for longer periods. They rented a house on West 54th Street, keeping the Cleveland residents for summers. Laura adapted to the new city, finding a Baptist church and establishing similar household routines. The children attended better schools. John maintained the same frugal habits, plain meals, early bedtimes, careful accounting of personal expenses. He avoided the opera, balls, and lavish dinners popular among other wealthy families. The trust years marked the peak of centralized control. John directed policy through the trustees while delegating daily management. He focused on long-term strategy, securing crude supplies, improving transportation, expanding markets abroad. The company became the largest and most efficient industrial organization in the country. Public awareness of its power grew slowly. Some newspapers began using the word monopoly in their stories. John read these accounts without changing his methods. He believed the efficiency benefited consumers through lower prices and reliable supply. Inside the family, the children developed distinct personalities. John Jr. showed interest in business and philanthropy from an early age. The girls pursued education and music. Laura guided their moral development with quiet firmness. John provided the financial security and occasional guidance. The household stayed orderly and deeply religious. Prayer and scripture anchored each day. During these years, John made several trips to the Pennsylvania oil regions. He walked among the derricks and talked with producers about supply contracts. The sight of wooden towers and pumping engines remained familiar. He negotiated long-term agreements that stabilized crude prices. Back in Cleveland, new office buildings rose downtown as the city continued its transformation into a major industrial center. Horse-drawn streetcars carried workers to the flats each morning. Women shopped at markets that now offered year-round produce thanks to better rail connections. John noticed these changes but kept his personal spending unchanged. Laura took on more responsibility for the children's education as they grew older. She arranged music lessons for the girls and ensured John Jr. received instruction in penmanship and arithmetic. The family ate dinner together almost every evening when John was in town. Conversation turned to current events, church activities, and plans for the next day. The children learned to speak respectfully and to finish their plates. Leftover food was never thrown away but turned into the next day's soup or stew. Clothing was mended and passed down. New garments came only when necessary. The Baptist church community provided a steady social anchor. John contributed large sums anonymously to build new churches in growing neighborhoods. He helped establish a mission society that sent workers to poorer districts. Laura organized women's groups that collected clothing and food for needy families. Sunday services lasted 2 hours, with strong singing and direct preaching. The family sat in the same pew each week. After services, they often invited the minister for a simple meal at home. By the time the trust was 2 years old, the company had extended its reach into new territories. Sales offices opened in Europe and Asia. Tankers carried American kerosene across the Atlantic. John studied maps of foreign markets and approved new shipping contracts. At the same time, he watched the first electric lighting systems appear in large cities. He understood that kerosene's dominance would not last forever and began thinking about the long-term future of the industry. The Rockefeller children experienced a protected but disciplined childhood. They played in the garden, read books from the family library, and helped with small chores. John Jr. showed a serious nature like his father. The girls enjoyed sewing and piano practice. Laura maintained a calm atmosphere even when John travelled for weeks. She wrote him regular letters describing the children's progress and household matters. John replied with advice and encouragement. This period of consolidation brought both immense power and quiet family routines. The trust gave Standard Oil the ability to plan on a national scale, while John maintained the same steady pace he had always known. The contrast between the company's reach and the simplicity of his home life remained striking. He moved between boardrooms and the family dinner table with the same measured step. Wealth and gilded age. This period of consolidation brought both immense power and quiet family routines. The trust gave Standard Oil the ability to plan on a national scale, while John maintained the same steady pace he had always known. The contrast between the company's reach and the simplicity of his home life remained striking. He moved between boardrooms and the family dinner table with the same measured step. By the late 1880s, the trust certificates had made John one of the richest men in the United States. Estimates placed his personal wealth in the hundreds of millions, though exact figures stayed private. Dividends from the trust arrived regularly, deposited into bank accounts in New York and Cleveland. Income came not only from kerosene sales, but from a widening array of petroleum products, lubricants for factory machines, paraffin for candles, fuel oils for steamships. The company now operated on a scale that touched nearly every corner of American industry. Exports filled ocean liners bound for Europe, Africa, and Asia. Domestic demand held strong even as gas lighting appeared in some cities. John handled the sudden scale of fortune with unchanged habits. He continued wearing dark wool suits cut in the same simple pattern, now from finer material but never ostentatious. His shirts remained white cotton, his ties narrow and plain. Shoes were sturdy and well polished, bought in pairs and worn until they needed repair. He still walked most places in New York when distance allowed, though carriages became necessary for longer trips. Meals stayed basic: oatmeal or eggs for breakfast, meat and vegetables for dinner, bread without butter unless needed for health. He drank water or milk, never alcohol or strong coffee. Cigars and tobacco never entered his life. The family divided time between Cleveland and New York. In Cleveland, the Euclid Avenue house remained the primary residence. Laura kept the same routines: gardening, sewing, managing the children's schedules. The older daughters attended local schools or had private tutors at home. John Jr. studied seriously, showing an early interest in numbers and organization. The household employed a few live-in servants now: a cook, a maid, and a coachman. Laura supervised them directly, insisting on careful use of supplies and honest work. No lavish entertaining occurred. Visitors were mostly church friends or business associates who came for quiet discussions. In New York, the family occupied a brownstone on West 54th Street, later moving to a larger but still restrained house on the same block. The interior stayed simple: solid furniture, plain rugs, walls painted in muted colours. Laura hung a few family portraits and landscapes, but avoided heavy ornamentation. The kitchen produced the same plain food as in Cleveland. Servants increased slightly, but Laura reviewed every grocery bill and household account. The children attended schools suited to their ages, always with emphasis on discipline and moral instruction. John walked to the trust offices on Lower Broadway most days, reviewing reports and meeting with executives. Evenings brought him home for family supper and prayer. The gilded age around them displayed wealth in ways John never adopted. Mansions rose along Fifth Avenue, with marble facades, crystal chandeliers, and ballrooms that hosted dinners for hundreds. Families like the Vanderbilts and Astors competed in extravagant private railroad cars, imported art, elaborate costumes for society events. Newspapers reported on these displays in detail: gowns costing thousands, jewels from Europe, yachts moored in Newport. John read the accounts without envy. He saw no purpose in such spending. His money went instead into bank deposits, government bonds, and careful investments in railroads and real estate. Personal frugality extended to small details. John carried coins in a small purse and counted change after every transaction. He mended his own gloves when they tore. At restaurants he ordered the simplest dishes and left no waste on the plate. When travelling by train he chose standard accommodations, not private cars. He avoided the new luxury hotels springing up in cities, preferring reliable but modest establishments. His only visible indulgence was a growing collection of books, history, economics, religious works kept in orderly shelves at home. Family life reflected the same restraint. The children received allowances scaled to their ages with strict instructions to account for every cent. Lucy, the eldest, managed her own small budget for clothes and books. John Jr. kept a ledger from an early age, recording earnings from odd jobs around the house. The girls learned sewing and household management from Laura. John spoke to them about the value of work and the danger of idleness. He never spoiled them with gifts. Birthdays brought practical items like new Bibles or school supplies. Vacations meant stays at quiet resorts in the Adirondacks or along the New Jersey shore, with simple cottages and walks in the woods. Church giving increased substantially. John supported Baptist missions across the country and abroad. He funded new churches in growing industrial towns. Contributions went to seminaries, training ministers. Laura organised local efforts to aid poor families through the church. The Rockefellers never publicised their donations. Many remained anonymous. John believed stewardship required quiet action rather than display. Sunday services continued as the anchor of the week. In New York they attended the Fifth Avenue Baptist Church, where the preaching emphasized personal responsibility and service. The contrast with the surrounding culture grew sharper. Newspapers filled with stories of robber barons, labor strikes, and urban poverty. Tenements in New York housed families in cramped rooms with shared privies. Child labor persisted in factories. John observed these conditions during walks through the city. He saw the need for better wages and conditions, but believed business efficiency would eventually raise standards. He avoided direct involvement in labor disputes, leaving such matters to plant managers. His focus stayed on internal improvements, better safety equipment in refineries, steadier employment for reliable workers. By the early 1890s, the family's wealth allowed larger moves without changing habits. John purchased land in the Pocantico Hills north of New York City, beginning what would become a family estate. The first house there remained modest, a frame structure with basic furnishings. Laura planted gardens and oversaw the grounds. The property offered space for the children to run and ride horses. John spent weekends there when possible, walking the trails and planning small improvements. The estate grew slowly, always with an eye toward usefulness rather than show. Daily routines in both cities held firm. John rose at the same hour, reviewed reports, attended meetings, returned home for family time. Laura managed the household calendar, school lessons, church events, visits to relatives. The children grew into young adults with the same values instilled from childhood. They dressed plainly, spoke respectfully, and avoided the excesses they saw in their classmates' families. John encouraged reading and discussion of current events, always tying them to moral lessons. Wealth accumulated steadily through trust dividends and reinvested profits. John kept large portions in liquid assets, ready for opportunities or downturns. He studied financial reports from other industries, noting patterns in steel, railroads, and banking. His personal ledger remained as precise as ever, tracking every expenditure from train fares to charitable contributions. The Gilded Age glittered around him, but he stayed apart from its shine. His life followed the same steady line he had drawn decades earlier: work, family, faith, and careful stewardship of resources. Rising criticism. Wealth accumulated steadily through trust dividends and reinvested profits. John kept large portions in liquid assets, ready for opportunities or downturns. He studied financial reports from other industries, noting patterns in steel, railroads, and banking. His personal ledger remained as precise as ever, tracking every expenditure from train fares to charitable contributions. The Gilded Age glittered around him, but he stayed apart from its shine. His life followed the same steady line he had drawn decades earlier: work, family, faith, and careful stewardship of resources. During the 1890s, the public view of large industrial combinations began to shift. Newspapers and magazines that once reported business news in neutral terms started running longer investigative pieces. Writers described the Standard Oil Trust as a force that squeezed out smaller refiners and dictated terms to railroads. The word monopoly appeared more frequently in editorials. Readers in small towns and cities learned about secret rebates and the pressure applied to independent producers. These accounts reached homes through daily papers delivered by train or wagon. John noticed the change gradually. He continued reading multiple newspapers each morning, Cleveland, New York, Chicago editions, marking articles that mentioned the company. At first, the stories focused on specific incidents: a Pennsylvania refiner claiming unfair competition, a railroad executive questioned about shipping rates. Then longer series appeared. Reporters traveled to oil regions, interviewed former employees, and examined court records from old lawsuits. John instructed company lawyers to respond factually when necessary, but avoided personal statements. He believed the efficiency of the organization spoke for itself through lower prices and wider availability of kerosene. In 1890, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act. The law aimed at combinations that restrained trade. At first, it saw little enforcement. Prosecutors targeted smaller groups more often than large national enterprises. Standard Oil lawyers studied the statute carefully, concluding that the trust structure, while centralized, did not clearly violate the new rules. John kept operations unchanged. Production continued, prices held steady or fell slightly, and market share remained dominant. The company now refined oil in multiple states, shipped through its own pipelines, and sold through a network of agents. Public unease grew during economic hard times. The panic of 1893 hit hard. Banks failed, factories closed, unemployment rose. Men stood in breadlines in New York and Chicago. Farmers in the Midwest watched crop prices drop, while railroad rates stayed high. Many blamed large corporations for the suffering. Pamphlets and speeches from populists pointed to trusts as the cause of concentrated wealth and widespread poverty. Standard Oil appeared often in these arguments. Speakers described John as the symbol of unchecked power, though few had met him or knew his daily life. In Cleveland, the local press remained more balanced. Reporters knew the company payroll supported thousands of families. The refineries along the river kept running through the Depression, providing steady work when other industries faltered. John maintained the same routines. He walked to the office, reviewed reports, returned home for plain meals with Laura and the children. The family felt the general economic strain indirectly: fewer church contributions from members, more requests for aid, but the household remained secure. John increased giving to relief efforts quietly, channeling funds through Baptist organizations to help unemployed workers and their families. By the mid-1890s, muckraking journalism gained wider reach. Magazines with national circulation printed detailed exposés. One series described the methods used to acquire competing refineries, quoting former owners who felt pressured. Another examined the trust's influence on state legislatures. John read these pieces without visible anger. He directed lawyers to prepare responses when facts were incorrect and to gather evidence of fair dealing. The company issued occasional statements through spokesmen, explaining that competition had been replaced by coordination for the benefit of consumers. Laura followed the coverage less closely, but noticed the tension in John's posture during certain evenings. She continued managing the home with calm efficiency. The children were now young adults or teenagers. John Jr. attended college, studying business and history. The daughters pursued education or charitable work. Family discussions sometimes touched on the newspaper stories. John answered questions directly but briefly, emphasizing that hard work and careful management had built the business. He encouraged the children to focus on their own responsibilities rather than public opinion. The criticism reached a new level in 1898 when Ida Tarbell began researching a major series. She was the daughter of an independent oil producer who had struggled against the trust years earlier. Tarbell spent months in libraries and oil towns, interviewing people and reading documents. Her articles appeared in McClure's magazine starting in 1902, though groundwork laid in the late 1890s. The pieces presented a detailed history of Standard Oil's rise, focusing on tactics that disadvantaged smaller operators. Readers across the country absorbed the narrative in monthly installments. The series built a picture of systematic elimination of competition. John declined to meet Tarbell or provide company records. He believed personal involvement would lend legitimacy to the attacks. Instead, he reviewed drafts of rebuttals prepared by associates. The company published corrections where errors appeared, but avoided broad counter-narratives. John continued daily work examining cost reports, approving pipeline extensions, planning new marketing territories. He saw the articles as one side of the story, incomplete without recognition of the benefits delivered to millions of households. By the turn of the century, public sentiment had hardened. Reform movements gained strength. Progressive politicians spoke of regulating big business. State attorneys general began reviewing antitrust laws. Ohio newspapers carried stories about possible investigations into the trust's operations within the state. John maintained the same composure. He increased time spent on philanthropy, directing larger sums to education and medical research through Baptist channels. He viewed these efforts as a practical response to criticism demonstrating responsible use of wealth. Family life provided steady counterweight. Laura organized quiet gatherings for church friends. The children visited home during school breaks. John walked the grounds at Pocantico Hills on weekends, overseeing modest improvements to the estate. He planted trees and planned roads with an eye toward long-term usefulness. The property remained private, away from public view. In New York, the family attended church regularly, sitting in the same pews. Sermons addressed justice and charity. John listened and continued his anonymous giving. The rising criticism did not alter daily habits. John rose early, read reports, met with executives, returned home for supper. Laura managed the household accounts with the same precision. The children carried forward the values of thrift and duty. The contrast remained: immense industrial power paired with personal restraint. Public debate grew louder, but John's focus stayed on facts, figures, and the next measured step: legal battles. The contrast remained: immense industrial power paired with personal restraint. Public debate grew louder, but John's focus stayed on facts, figures, and the next measured step. In the closing years of the 1890s, state officials began to act against the Standard Oil Trust. Ohio's Attorney General filed suit in 1892, claiming the trust violated state corporation laws by controlling companies outside its charter. The case moved slowly through courts. Witnesses testified about acquisitions and shipping arrangements. John did not appear in person. He provided affidavits through lawyers. The Ohio Supreme Court ruled against the trust in 1892, ordering dissolution of the local holding structure. The company complied by reorganizing assets into separate corporations while keeping effective coordination through common ownership and shared directors. Operations continued without major interruption. John stepped back from daily management around 1897. He had turned 58 and felt the weight of constant oversight. He delegated routine decisions to trusted executives like John D. Archbold, who handled New York headquarters. John retained final authority on major policy, but spent less time at desks reviewing ledgers. Instead, he focused on broader strategy and philanthropy. He travelled more often to inspect properties and meet with key associates. His personal routine shifted slightly more time at Pocantico Hills, longer stays in Florida during winter, but the core habits remained: early rising, plain meals, careful reading of reports. The Ohio decision set a pattern. Other states watched closely. New Jersey allowed more flexible corporate structures, so the trust reincorporated there in 1899 as Standard Oil Company, New Jersey. The new parent company held stock in subsidiaries across the country. This arrangement complied with state laws while preserving centralized control. John approved the change after reviewing the legal opinions. The reorganization drew little immediate public notice. Newspapers reported it factually alongside other business news. Federal attention increased after 1900. The Industrial Commission, a congressional body studying trusts, held hearings in 1900 and 1901. Executives testified about operations. Archbold and others explained rebates as volume discounts and defended market practices as efficient. John did not testify. His lawyers handled appearances. The Commission's report criticized concentrated power, but recommended no immediate action. The findings fed growing calls for stronger federal regulation. In 1902, President Theodore Roosevelt directed the Justice Department to investigate Standard Oil under the Sherman Act. Agents gathered documents from company offices in New York, Cleveland, and other cities. They subpoenaed records, interviewed former employees, and examined freight contracts. John cooperated through counsel, providing requested materials without personal involvement. The investigation stretched over years, building a massive record of correspondence, ledgers, and testimony. Laura noticed the strain during this period. John read more legal briefs at home in the evenings. She maintained the household calm, simple suppers of broiled fish or lamb chops, vegetables from the market, tea instead of coffee. The children, now adults or near it, visited regularly. John Jr. had finished college and begun work in the family offices, learning the business step by step. The daughters pursued their own paths: charity work, education, family. Family prayers continued each evening, with John reading scripture in his steady voice. The public atmosphere grew more hostile. Magazines ran cartoons showing John as a giant, squeezing small refiners in his fist. Newspapers printed headlines about the octopus of Standard Oil. Reform speakers toured cities calling for breakup of the trust. John read these accounts but rarely commented. He believed the company's record: lower prices, reliable supply, steady employment countered the accusations. At church he heard sermons on justice and patience. He increased contributions to education and health causes, viewing them as constructive responses. In 1906, Kansas filed an ouster suit against the Standard Oil Company of Kansas, alleging monopolistic practices. Similar actions followed in Missouri, Texas, and other states. Each case required separate legal defense. Company lawyers traveled to state capitals, presented evidence of compliance with local laws, and argued that integration improved efficiency. Outcomes varied. Some suits succeeded in limiting local operations, others were dismissed or settled. John followed developments through weekly summaries sent to Pocantico or New York. By 1907, the federal case gained momentum. The Justice Department filed a major antitrust suit in St. Louis Federal Court, naming Standard Oil of New Jersey and dozens of subsidiaries. The complaint charged restraint of trade through rebates, predatory pricing, and control of pipelines. The trial lasted months. Hundreds of witnesses testified. Company records filled courtrooms. John again stayed away, providing depositions when required. Executives defended the business as a natural result of superior management. During these legal pressures, John spent more time on philanthropy. He had already funded the University of Chicago generously since the 1890s. Now, he expanded support for medical research and Southern education. The General Education Board, established in 1902, received large endowments to improve schools in the South. John reviewed grant proposals personally, favouring projects with measurable results. These efforts received positive press even as antitrust news dominated headlines. Family life offered quiet stability. Laura managed the New York and Pocantico households with the same efficiency. The estate in the hills had grown more land acquired, roads improved, a larger main house built but remained private. John walked the grounds daily when there, observing tree growth and planning small additions. Winters in Florida began regularly after 1900. They rented cottages at Ormond Beach, enjoying mild weather and golf on simple courses. John played steadily, keeping score in a small notebook. Laura read and walked along the shore. The children adapted to the public scrutiny. John Jr. worked closely with his father, handling increasing responsibilities. He shared the same reserved manner and attention to detail. The daughters married or pursued independent lives while staying connected to family values. Church attendance remained constant services in New York or at local chapels near Pocantico. John contributed to building funds and mission work without seeking notice. By 1909, the St. Louis court ruled against Standard Oil. The judge ordered dissolution of the holding company structure. Appeals went to the Supreme Court. The company continued normal operations during the delay. John maintained his reduced-role strategic oversight rather than daily details. He focused more on giving. The Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, founded in 1901, received steady funding. Early work on diseases showed promise. John saw these efforts as a legacy beyond business. The legal battles dragged on without disrupting family routines. John rose early, read reports, met with advisors when needed, spent evenings with Laura or walking the estate. His health remained good, regular walks, simple diet, no excesses. The public fight over the trust continued in courtrooms and newspapers. John observed it steadily, confident that the company's contributions outweighed the criticisms. He prepared for possible changes while keeping his personal life unchanged. 1,911 breakup. The legal battles dragged on without disrupting family routines. John rose early, read reports, met with advisors when needed, spent evenings with Laura or walking the estate. His health remained good, regular walks, simple diet, no excesses. The public fight over the trust continued in courtrooms and newspapers. John observed it steadily, confident that the company's contributions outweighed the criticisms. He prepared for possible changes while keeping his personal life unchanged. The final chapter of the legal struggle arrived on the 15th of May, 1911. The United States Supreme Court issued its unanimous decision in the case of Standard Oil Company of New Jersey, et al. v. United States. Chief Justice Edward Douglas White wrote the opinion. The court ruled that the trust structure violated the Sherman Antitrust Act. It ordered the holding company to dissolve within 6 months. The 34 separate corporations that had operated under the trust would now function as independent entities. Each would own its own refineries, pipelines, tank cars, and marketing networks. Shares in the parent company would be distributed proportionally to stockholders. The breakup did not destroy the business. It simply removed the central control that had bound everything together for nearly 30 years. John learned of the ruling through a telephone call at Pocantico Hills. He was in his study reviewing the morning mail when the line rang. Archbold in New York delivered the news in a calm voice. John listened without interruption, then thanked him and hung up. He sat quietly for several minutes, looking out across the rolling lawns. No anger or surprise showed on his face. He had followed every stage of the case through weekly summaries. The outcome matched what many legal experts had predicted after the lower court decision in 1909. John viewed the ruling as a change in legal form rather than a threat to the underlying value of the enterprises. The companies remained strong. Their combined assets, technology, and market positions were intact. He simply noted the date in his personal calendar and returned to the day's correspondence. Associates reacted in varied ways. Archbold, who had managed daily operations for years, expressed quiet disappointment at the forced separation, but quickly turned to practical steps. He and other executives began drafting reorganization plans. Lawyers in New York and Cleveland worked through the details of stock distribution and new corporate charters. Some younger managers worried about lost efficiencies and possible price wars among the new entities. John reassured them through meetings and letters. He pointed out that each successor company inherited proven systems, experienced personnel, and established customer relationships. Competition among them, if it arose, would be fair and limited by the same cost disciplines they had always practiced. The 6-month period for dissolution passed methodically. On the 15th of November 1911, the certificates for the 34 companies were issued to stockholders. Standard Oil of New Jersey became the largest, controlling East Coast refining and export trade. Standard Oil of Indiana took the Midwest operations. Standard Oil of California handled the Pacific Coast. Smaller entities emerged for specific pipelines, tank cars, and regional marketing. The familiar blue barrels continued rolling out of plants, now under new corporate names. Workers received new pay envelopes but reported to the same foremen and followed the same shift schedules. John held shares in all the successor companies, maintaining his position as the largest individual owner. Cleveland felt the change in subtle ways. The riverfront plants operated under their new corporate identities, yet the daily rhythm stayed the same. Whistles still signaled shift starts. Trains arrived with crude on the same tracks. Local newspapers reported the breakup factually, noting that payrolls and tax payments would continue without interruption. Merchants who supplied barrels and equipment noticed no immediate difference in orders. Families of refinery workers saw steady wages through the winter months. John spent much of 1911 at Pocantico or in Florida. He walked the estate paths each morning, checking on tree plantings and road improvements. Laura accompanied him on shorter outings, discussing the children's activities. John Jr., now in his late 30s, handled increasing family business matters. He travelled between New York and the various successor companies, learning their separate operations. The daughters visited often with their own families. Evenings at the estate brought the same Bible readings and quiet conversations. John mentioned the court decision only once or twice, describing it as a legal adjustment that would not alter the fundamental strengths of the oil business. Public reaction varied across the country. Some newspapers celebrated the ruling as a victory for small business and consumers. Others noted that the successor companies remained large and efficient, likely to dominate their regions. Cartoonists drew images of the octopus losing its arms. Reform politicians claimed credit for curbing monopoly power. John read these accounts during his train rides or at the breakfast table. He made no public statements. Instead, he continued his regular pattern of reviewing dividend statements from the new companies and approving further philanthropic grants. The breakup coincided with broader changes in the industry. Automobile use was rising rapidly. Gasoline, once a waste product of kerosene refining, became the focus of new demand. The successor companies invested heavily in research and distribution networks for motor fuel. John watched these developments with interest. He saw the shift as natural progress rather than disruption. Pipelines expanded, new refineries specialized in different fractions, and marketing adapted to filling stations springing up along roads. The separate corporations competed where markets overlapped, yet cooperation on technical standards continued through industry associations. Family routines absorbed the transition smoothly. Laura maintained the same household standards in New York, Cleveland, and Florida. Meals remained plain oatmeal, fresh vegetables, simple meats. The children and grandchildren kept ledgers for their allowances. Church attendance stayed central. In Ormond Beach, during the winter of 1911 to 1912, John played golf daily on the modest course, recording his scores in the same small notebook. Laura walked the beach and read. They spoke little of business, preferring discussions of missionary work or the grandchildren's studies. By early 1912, the 34 companies had settled into their independent identities. Stock prices adjusted in the market. Some rose, as investors recognized the value in focused operations. John monitored the quotations without excitement. His personal wealth, spread across the new entities, remained substantial. He increased giving through the Rockefeller Foundation, which had received its charter in 1913, but whose planning began earlier. Funds supported public health campaigns and university endowments. These efforts received favourable coverage, providing a quiet counterpoint to lingering antitrust commentary. The end of the monopoly era brought no dramatic change to John's daily life. He continued rising at the same hour, walking the same paths, eating the same meals. Associates noted his calm acceptance of the ruling. They saw it as consistent with the discipline he had practiced since boyhood. The companies themselves thrived separately, proving the underlying systems were sound. Rail shipments continued, kerosene and gasoline reached homes and automobiles, and employment levels held steady. The legal chapter closed, but the industrial story moved forward under new corporate names. John viewed the dissolution as confirmation that careful management endured beyond any single structure. The 34 companies carried forward the habits of precision and efficiency he had instilled decades earlier. He turned more attention to philanthropy and family, confident that the business foundation he had built would serve the country well in its new form. Philanthropy turn. The breakup coincided with broader changes in the industry. Automobile use was rising rapidly. Gasoline, once a waste product of kerosene refining, became the focus of new demand. The successor companies invested heavily in research and distribution networks for motor fuel. John watched these developments with interest. He saw the shift as natural progress rather than disruption. Pipelines expanded, new refineries specialized in different fractions, and marketing adapted to filling stations springing up along roads. The separate corporations competed where markets overlapped, yet cooperation on technical standards continued through industry associations. Family routines absorbed the transition smoothly. Laura maintained the same household standards in New York, Cleveland, and Florida. Meals remained plain oatmeal, fresh vegetables, simple meats. The children and grandchildren kept ledgers for their allowances. Church attendance stayed central. In Ormond Beach, during the winter of 1911 to 1912, John played golf daily on the modest course, recording his scores in the same small notebook. Laura walked the beach and read. They spoke little of business, preferring discussions of missionary work or the grandchildren's studies. By early 1912, the 34 companies had settled into their independent identities. Stock prices adjusted in the market. Some rose as investors recognized the value in focused operations. John monitored the quotations without excitement. His personal wealth, spread across the new entities, remained substantial. He increased giving through structured channels that had been developing for years. The turn towards systematic philanthropy had begun well before the breakup. In the 1890s, John started directing large sums to Baptist missions and educational institutions. He funded the establishment of Spelman College in Atlanta, named for Laura's family, to provide higher education for black women. The college received steady support for buildings, faculty salaries, and scholarships. John reviewed annual reports from the institution, noting enrollment growth and graduation rates. He saw the work as practical equipping individuals with skills for self-reliance. The University of Chicago became his most significant early commitment. In 1890, he responded to a proposal from Baptist leaders seeking a new institution in the Midwest. John pledged initial funds for land and buildings. Over the next 2 decades, he gave tens of millions, making the university one of the leading research centers in the country. He insisted on strong academic standards and administrative efficiency. Trustees reported directly to him on budgets and progress. He visited the campus several times, walking the quadrangles and speaking with professors about their work in science and history. The university's growth from a few buildings to a full campus with libraries and laboratories pleased him as evidence of careful stewardship. By the late 1890s, John began planning more organized giving. He consulted with advisors on creating permanent mechanisms. In 1901, he established the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research in New York City. The institute focused on laboratory studies of disease causes and treatments. early work centered on pathology and bacteriology. John provided land on the East River and initial endowments. He followed the Institute's progress through detailed reports, noting discoveries in yellow fever and other infections. The work aligned with his belief in scientific methods applied to human problems. The General Education Board formed in 1902 with a broad charter to improve schooling across the United States, especially in the rural South. John supplied the bulk of the initial funds. The board sent agents to assess school conditions, dilapidated buildings, short terms, poorly trained teachers, grant-supported teacher training, new textbooks, and longer school years. John reviewed summaries of these efforts, favouring projects that measured results through attendance figures and student performance. The board's work reached thousands of one-room schools, gradually raising standards in underserved areas. These early philanthropic efforts followed clear principles. John preferred institutions with strong leadership and measurable outcomes. He avoided scattershot giving. Funds went to organisations that could sustain themselves over time. He kept personal involvement limited to board memberships and occasional site visits. Laura shared his outlook. She focused on women's education and missionary work, contributing through church networks. After the 1911 breakup, John accelerated the shift. Dividends from the successor companies arrived regularly, providing steady resources. He worked with advisors to consolidate giving under fewer umbrellas. The University of Chicago received additional grants for medical and scientific departments. The Rockefeller Institute expanded its laboratories and staff. The General Education Board increased its scope, funding county school superintendents and agricultural education programs. In 1913, the Rockefeller Foundation received its charter from the New York legislature. John transferred substantial assets to the new entity. The foundation aimed at promoting the well-being of mankind worldwide. Early programs targeted public health, medical education, and social science research. John served as a trustee, but delegated daily decisions to a small professional staff. He reviewed annual plans, approving major initiatives while keeping his role strategic. Daily life during these years reflected the gradual transition. John spent mornings at Pocantico reading foundation reports alongside business statements. He walked the estate paths, often alone, thinking through grant proposals. Laura joined him for shorter walks, discussing family news. Meals stayed simple: boiled chicken, rice, garden vegetables. Evenings brought family gatherings when children and grandchildren visited. John asked about their work and studies, encouraging careful planning. Winters in Florida continued. The Ormond Beach cottage overlooked the ocean. John played golf most days, walking the course with a caddy. Scores improved slightly with practice. Laura read on the veranda or visited local churches. The mild climate suited his health. He avoided the larger resort hotels, preferring the quiet routine. By the mid-1910s, philanthropy occupied more of John's attention than business oversight. The successor companies ran efficiently under their own managements. John received quarterly summaries but rarely intervened. His wealth continued growing through dividends and careful investments. Giving increased accordingly. The Rockefeller Foundation launched international health campaigns, hookworm eradication in the American South, malaria control in several countries. John followed these projects through field reports, noting infection rates and treatment numbers. Family members became involved. John Jr. joined foundation boards, learning the mechanics of large-scale giving. He travelled to inspect projects, bringing back detailed observations. The daughters supported related causes through their own efforts. Laura continued her church work, focusing on women's missions. The household remained orderly servants managed under strict guidelines. No waste tolerated. The philanthropy turn marked a deliberate redirection. John saw it as the logical next phase. Business success had provided the means. Now the responsibility lay in using those resources for broader benefit. He applied the same habits of precision and accountability that had built Standard Oil. Grants required clear proposals, regular reporting, and evidence of results. The approach, produced lasting institutions and measurable improvements in education and health. Medical and education boards. John welcomed the change quietly, continuing his steady pace. The Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, established in 1901, became one of the central focuses of his giving during the 1910s. Located on a bluff overlooking the East River in New York City, the institute occupied a group of laboratory buildings designed for scientific work. John provided the initial land and endowment of several $1 million. He appointed a board of scientific advisors to guide operations. The institute's mission was clear: conduct original research into the causes and prevention of disease. Early laboratories concentrated on pathology, bacteriology, and physiology. Scientists there studied yellow fever, polio, and hookworm. John reviewed annual reports that listed specific investigations and their results. He never interfered with the research methods, but insisted on clear accounting of expenditures. By 1910, the institute had expanded its staff. Researchers worked in well-equipped rooms with microscopes and controlled environments. Field teams traveled to affected areas to collect samples. The hookworm campaign in the American South, launched through the institute's influence, treated thousands of cases in rural counties. Infection rates dropped measurably in treated districts. John received updates on these campaigns, noting the number of patients examined and the doses of medicine distributed. The work aligned with his preference for practical results that improved daily life for ordinary people. The institute also advanced medical education. It affiliated with hospitals where new doctors received training in laboratory techniques. John funded scholarships for promising students from modest backgrounds. He examined lists of recipients, checking their academic records and future plans. The program produced physicians who returned to smaller communities with updated knowledge. By the mid-1910s, the Institute's publications appeared in professional journals, sharing findings on disease transmission and treatment protocols. John kept copies of these papers in his study at Pocantico, reading sections during quiet evenings. Parallel to the medical work, the General Education Board operated across a different field. Established in 1902, the board aimed to strengthen public schooling, particularly in the rural South. Agents visited one-room schoolhouses in Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi. They documented short terms, inadequate buildings, and teachers with limited preparation. John allocated funds for county school supervisors, who trained local educators. The board supplied textbooks and basic equipment. Reports showed increased attendance and longer school years in supported districts. John studied these figures carefully, comparing costs per pupil against improvements in literacy rates. Higher learning institutions also benefited. The board supported colleges for black students in the South, including Morehouse and Spelman. John had helped found Spelman earlier through Baptist channels. Now the board expanded its reach with grants for faculty salaries and new buildings. Students at these colleges studied teaching methods and agriculture. Graduates returned to rural areas as instructors. John visited a few campuses during southern trips, walking the grounds and speaking briefly with administrators. He noted the neat classrooms and the serious demeanor of the young people. Daily life for John during these years followed its familiar pattern. He rose at 6, ate a plain breakfast of oatmeal and fruit, then reviewed reports from both the Institute and the Education Board. Mornings often included meetings with Foundation staff in New York. He listened to presentations on field results, asking precise questions about numbers and timelines. Afternoons brought walks at Pocantico, or, in winter, along the Ormond Beach shore. Laura accompanied him on many outings, sharing observations about family matters. The children visited regularly. John Jr. joined board meetings, learning the process of evaluating proposals. The daughters supported related causes through church groups. Cleveland operations remained part of the routine. John still travelled there several times each year to check on successor companies and local giving. The refineries along the Cuyahoga continued under their new names, but his attention had shifted. He met with church leaders to discuss education projects in Ohio. The Erie Street Baptist Church received modest support for its community programs. Laura managed the Euclid Avenue house during these visits, keeping the same orderly schedule. Meals featured simple fare, pot roast, potatoes, bread. Evenings ended with scripture reading. The Education Board expanded its work in the 1910s. It funded teacher training institutes where rural instructors learned modern methods. Summer sessions attracted hundreds of participants. The board also supported agricultural extension programs, teaching better farming techniques alongside school improvements. John approved these initiatives after reviewing cost breakdowns. He favoured projects that combined education with economic self-sufficiency. In the South, county agents demonstrated crop rotation and soil conservation. Farmers who participated reported higher yields. The board tracked these gains in annual summaries. Medical research at the institute progressed steadily. By 1915, teams had developed improved treatments for pellagra, a disease common in the South. Field studies identified dietary causes and distributed supplements. Infection rates declined in tested communities. John read the detailed case studies, noting the number of families helped. The institute also contributed to wartime efforts during World War I. Researchers worked on vaccines and wound treatments for soldiers. John supported these projects without public announcement, viewing them as part of national service. Family routines adapted to the growing philanthropic demands. Laura organised small gatherings at Pocantico for board members and church friends. She prepared simple refreshments and listened to discussions about school conditions. The grandchildren played on the estate lawns while adults reviewed reports. John taught the younger ones basic accounting, just as he had with his own children. Allowances came with ledger books. The household staff followed strict guidelines on resource use. No waste appeared in kitchens or gardens. By the late 1910s, the General Education Board had influenced schooling in more than 1,000 counties. Teacher salaries rose in supported areas. School terms lengthened from 3 months to 7 or 8. John examined maps showing the spread of these improvements. He noted the concentration in southern states where needs were greatest. The board also funded university departments of education, training future administrators. John approved these grants after checking enrollment and placement records. The institute expanded its international reach during this decade. It supported research stations in China and Latin America. Teams studied tropical diseases and trained local physicians. John reviewed travel reports from these outposts, noting challenges of climate and transportation. Results included better control of malaria through drainage projects. He saw these efforts as extensions of the same principles applied at home systematic study, leading to practical solutions. Winter stays in Florida provided balance. John played golf most mornings on the Ormond course, walking the fairways and recording scores. The mild air and ocean views refreshed him. Laura read on the veranda, corresponding with family. They attended a local Baptist church on Sundays. John contributed quietly to its building fund. Evenings brought simple suppers and conversations about the week's reports. The contrast between scientific laboratories and quiet beach walks remained part of his steady rhythm. By 1920, the medical and education boards had produced measurable changes. Hookworm infections dropped sharply in treated southern counties. School attendance rose in hundreds of districts. Universities trained new generations of researchers and teachers. John continued his personal simplicity, plain suits, careful meals, early bedtimes. He walked the same paths at Pocantico, reviewing the same type of detailed summaries that had guided his business decisions decades earlier. Philanthropy had become the main focus, yet the habits of precision and accountability never changed. The boards operated with professional staffs who handled daily administration. John served as a trustee, attending occasional meetings and approving major directions. He preferred written reports over long discussions. Laura supported the work through her own church connections, focusing on women's education programs. The family remained closely involved. John Jr. took on increasing responsibilities, travelling to inspect projects. The structure allowed John to step back while maintaining oversight. These years of board work reinforced John's long-held belief in methodical improvement. Scientific research and better schooling addressed root causes of hardship. He saw results in letters from teachers and physicians who credited the programs. Public reports on foundation activities appeared in newspapers, shifting attention from earlier controversies. John welcomed the change without comment, continuing his daily walks and ledger reviews. The Medical Institute and Education Board had become established institutions by the early 1920s. Laboratories produced ongoing discoveries. Schools across regions showed lasting gains. John turned his attention toward even broader efforts, confident that these foundations provided solid ground for future work. Later family life. The foundation's broad mandate allowed flexibility. It addressed emerging needs while building on proven programs. John approved new initiatives after careful review. The structure he helped create endured beyond his direct involvement. Reports continued arriving at Pocantico, where he read them in the same study that had once held Standard Oil ledgers. In the 1920s and 1930s, John spent increasing portions of each year at Pocantico Hills. The estate had become the primary family home. He had acquired additional land over the decades until it covered several thousand acres of wooded hills and open fields north of New York City. The main house, a large stone structure with simple lines, sat on a rise overlooking the Hudson River Valley. John walked the grounds every morning he was able, following gravel paths lined with maples and oaks he had planted years earlier. Gardeners maintained vegetable plots and flower beds under Laura's direction. She selected seeds each spring and supervised harvesting. The produce went to the kitchen or local charities. John played golf less often now. In his 90s, he used a cart on the private course at Pocantico. He kept score in the same small notebook, though scores mattered less than the steady walk. Laura sometimes joined him for shorter rounds, driving the cart while he played. They spoke of family news, foundation projects, and church activities. The estate included guest cottages where children and grandchildren stayed during visits. The grounds offered space for the younger ones to run and explore without leaving the property. Summers at Pocantico brought the family together. John Jr. arrived with his wife and children. The daughters came with their families. Meals took place on the terrace or in the dining room. Breakfast included fresh fruit, oatmeal, and eggs from the estate chickens. Lunches were light sandwiches, soup, garden vegetables. Dinners featured simple roasts or fish with potatoes and greens. John sat at the head of the table, listening more than speaking. He asked the grandchildren about school and encouraged them to keep small account books for their allowances. Laura managed the household with quiet authority. Servants now numbering a dozen handled cooking, cleaning, and grounds work. She reviewed every grocery list and linen inventory. Waste remained forbidden. Leftover food became soup or fed to the estate animals. Clothing was mended and handed down. The children and grandchildren wore practical outfits, cotton dresses for the girls, sturdy shirts and trousers for the boys. No display entered the daily life. Winters shifted to Ormond Beach, Florida. The family rented the same modest cottage overlooking the ocean. John walked the beach path each morning, supported by a cane when needed. The salt air and mild temperatures eased his joints. He played a few holes of golf when strength allowed, otherwise sat on the veranda watching the waves. Laura read aloud from newspapers or foundation reports. They attended a local Baptist church on Sundays. John contributed to its programs without seeking recognition. The Depression years of the 1930s affected the country deeply. Unemployment rose, banks closed, farms failed. The foundation increased aid to education and health programs. John reviewed adjusted budgets that redirected funds to immediate needs, school lunches, rural clinics. He approved grants for unemployment relief through established channels. At home, the family felt no personal hardship. Dividends from the successor companies continued, though reduced. John maintained cash reserves and adjusted spending only slightly fewer new books, simpler meals. He increased giving where possible, directing funds to soup kitchens and job training through church networks. John Jr. managed more of the foundation and family business affairs. He travelled frequently, inspecting projects and meeting with trustees. His reports back to his father grew more detailed. John read them in his study, marking sections with a pencil. The older man offered concise advice in return. Focus on results, avoid waste, build for permanence. The daughters supported charitable causes in their communities. Grandchildren visited during school breaks, filling the house with quieter energy than in earlier decades. Church remained the steady centre. At Pocantico, the family attended a small chapel on the estate. Services were simple hymns, scripture, short sermons on duty and service. John sat in the same pew each week. In Florida, they joined a local congregation, contributing to building funds and missions. Prayer continued nightly at home. John read passages from the Bible in his measured voice. Laura sometimes led the reading when his eyes tired. Daily routines stayed fixed even as age advanced. John rose at the same hour, though he rested more during the day. Breakfast came early: oatmeal, fruit, tea. Mornings brought mail and reports. He dictated letters to a secretary. Afternoons included short walks or rest on the veranda. Evenings gathered the household for supper and conversation. Bedtime arrived early. The estate staff ensured quiet after dark. Health declined gradually. John experienced occasional weakness and relied more on assistance for walking. Doctors visited regularly, prescribing rest and simple remedies. Laura supervised his care with calm efficiency. She prepared nourishing broths and ensured he followed medical advice. Family members rotated visits to provide company. Grandchildren read to him or sat quietly nearby. The 1930s brought changes in the world around them. Automobiles filled roads, radios brought news into homes, motion pictures drew crowds. John observed these developments from afar. He read about them in newspapers but rarely participated. The estate remained private, no large parties, no public events. Visitors were limited to family, close associates, and occasional foundation staff. By the mid-1930s, John spent most of his time at Pocantico or Ormond. Travel became difficult. He followed foundation work through summaries and John Jr.'s accounts. The organisation continued its campaigns. Hookworm nearly eradicated in many areas, malaria control expanding, medical schools strengthening. John noted the cumulative impact in annual reports: millions treated, thousands trained, institutions built. Family life centred on quiet continuity. Laura managed the households in both places. She kept the same standards of order and thrift. The children and grandchildren carried forward the values of discipline and service. John spoke less but listened attentively. His presence anchored the gatherings. Meals, walks, prayers, these small routines held steady. The estate at Pocantico provided a peaceful setting for reflection. The ocean at Ormond offered calm views. Through it all, the habits formed in childhood, early rising, careful records, simple living, remained unchanged. By the mid-1930s, John had reached his mid-90s. Movement became slower and more deliberate. He relied on a cane for walks, even the short ones around the house at Pocantico. The daily routine adjusted accordingly. He rose at the usual hour, but spent more time resting in an armchair by the window. Breakfast arrived on a tray: oatmeal, a slice of toast, weak tea. A nurse assisted with dressing and medications. Laura supervised every detail, ensuring the room stayed comfortable and the schedule unbroken. She read aloud from newspapers or letters when his eyes strained. The foundation continued its work without requiring his daily input. John Jr. managed operations fully now. He visited Pocantico regularly, bringing concise summaries of grants awarded, projects completed, and new proposals under review. John listened attentively, asked a few pointed questions about costs and outcomes, then nodded approval or suggested minor adjustments. The conversations stayed brief. John spoke in a quiet voice, conserving energy. The successor oil companies sent routine dividend statements. He glanced at the figures but left investment decisions to trusted advisors. Family visits filled the weeks. Grandchildren came in small groups, sitting with him on the veranda or in the study. They spoke of school, jobs, and daily life. John offered short pieces of advice: save consistently, give thoughtfully, avoid waste. He handed out small allowances as he always had, with the same instruction to keep accurate records. The younger ones brought drawings or school reports. He examined them carefully, commenting on neatness and effort. Laura organised these gatherings, ensuring quiet and order. Summers at Pocantico remained the main season for family. The house stayed cool with shaded porches and open windows. John sat outside most afternoons, watching the grounds. Gardeners worked nearby, trimming hedges and tending flowers. He noticed small changes, new blooms, a repaired path, and mentioned them to Laura. Evenings brought supper in the dining room. The table held simple food: clear soup, broiled chicken, mashed potatoes, stewed fruit. Conversation flowed gently around family news and church events. After the meal, John retired early, reading scripture or listening to a radio program tuned low. Winters in Florida continued until travel became too taxing. The Ormond Beach cottage served as a quiet retreat in the early 1930s. John walked the beach path with assistance, breathing the salt air. Golf ended entirely. He sat on the veranda instead, observing the ocean and passing ships. Laura read to him from foundation reports or family letters. They attended church when possible, though services at home became more common. The mild climate helped, but by 1935 the trips south stopped. Pocantico remained the year-round home. Health declined steadily but without sudden crisis. Doctors visited weekly, checking blood pressure and heart function. John followed their advice: rest, light diet, no strain. He experienced occasional discomfort but never complained. Laura stayed close, managing care with calm efficiency. The household staff adjusted duties to support her. John maintained his personal ledger for small expenses: gifts to grandchildren, contributions to church, written in a large, careful hand. In the spring of 1937, John grew noticeably weaker. He spent most days in bed or in a chair by the window. Visitors were limited to immediate family. John Jr. came often, sitting for long quiet periods. The daughters visited in turn. Grandchildren appeared briefly, speaking softly. John recognized everyone, though conversation became minimal. He listened to scripture readings from Laura or one of the children. The Bible remained open on the bedside table. On the 23rd of May 1937, John passed away at Pocantico Hills. He was 97 years old. The end came peacefully in the early morning. Laura and John Jr. were present. No dramatic moment marked the passing. The household learned gradually through the day. A family doctor confirmed the time of death. Arrangements followed quickly and simply. The funeral service took place at the small chapel on the estate. Only close family and a few long-time associates attended. The minister spoke briefly on stewardship and faith. Burial occurred in the family plot at Lakeview Cemetery in Cleveland, near his mother and Laura's family. News of the death reached the public through brief statements. Newspapers carried front-page notices, recalling his role in the oil industry and later philanthropy. Editorials reflected on the arc of his life, from modest beginnings to vast wealth to systematic giving. Some revisited old antitrust controversies. Others focused on the foundation's impact: millions treated for disease, schools strengthened, medical advances supported. Radio broadcasts mentioned the event in calm tones. Stock prices of the successor companies showed little movement. The businesses had long operated independently. The family observed a quiet mourning period. Laura remained at Pocantico, maintaining the household routines. John Jr. handled necessary matters: legal documents, memorial contributions. The children and grandchildren gathered for private remembrance. The estate stayed closed to outsiders. Church services included prayers for the family. Laura continued her own giving through church channels. Reactions from the wider world varied. Business leaders noted the passing of an era in American industry. Foundation staff and beneficiaries reflected on the institutions he had helped build. Ordinary households remembered cheaper kerosene and brighter lamps from earlier decades. Medical researchers credited support for their work. School administrators in the South recalled improved conditions in rural districts. The Foundation issued a brief statement on continued commitment to its mission. Now the lights dim slowly in the rooms he knew. The paths outside lie quiet under starlight. A soft breeze moves through the trees he planted. The river flows on below, steady as ever. Rest well in the calm that follows a long journey.